So the, the first topic is really about short-term rentals. And there's lots of, I think I heard a reference to like accessory dwelling units. Well, this is really focused on the idea that many of these rentals and some of those accessory dwelling units are going to have a lot more turnover than a typical rental. So that's really what this presentation is going to focus on. But we're actually going to talk first about the real need for education around short-term rentals. Then we're going to talk about design, installation management, and knowing that some of you are regulators, talking about some regulator issues. Generally speaking, I feel like most of our regulations, and I certainly can't speak for Washington, do not well deal with many of the issues we're going to talk about. It looks like a house. So most regulations have not specifically addressed this, particularly on a state level. I do know more and more counties and even some state programs are looking at how do we deal with short-term rentals in a more, I would say, straightforward way with the goal of system longevity. I mean, that's what, I know sometimes we view our rules to be consumer protection or not to be consumer protection, but the challenge is at the end of the day, no one wants a system that lasts 5 years. So our number one goal is always public, is protecting public health and the environment, but people do want a long-term sustainable solution. And sometimes if we start to cut corners on the design or not truly looking at the intended use of the structure, I think we can run into challenges. So the first topic, again, thinking about just the overview of the topic and the need for education around it. So it seems every year we're surpassing more and more rentals. And, I'm part of this group in that when I regularly travel, actually, we just booked tickets to go to the Sphere. And, and you think of Las Vegas being the town, right? That there's so many hotels, but there's two couples. I'd rather be in a condo, right? Where we have open space to share, right? Instead of being in a cramped hotel room. So we rented from Airbnb. And so these exist in certainly towns like Vegas, but they exist everywhere. I don't know if you've ever been on a road trip. You can be basically in the middle of nowhere and someone's renting out their old farmstead. So more and more homes and vacation properties and farms and you name it. I once saw a rental right where someone had an RV parked in their driveway that they were renting out. So people are getting creative in lots of different ways. But from our practical standpoint, when it comes to septic systems, we just know that more people are going to be renting out their homes and cabins either on a part-time or full-time basis. They're sometimes going to use it for a month out of the year. And when they're there, they'll have all their friends. And then the rest of the year, right, they'll be renting it out. So some of the overall big challenge is these systems are, because they're going to be used much heavier, may need more maintenance and management. And there is the risk that, with this higher usage and sometimes not educated usage, that they could actually do damage. And just impact longevity. I mean, the one thing I think about is, like miles on your car. Well, to some degree, again, when you have other people using your septic system, you are sending more water out there. You are putting more mileage on it. So you may be impacting the life. And it takes a lot of rentals to pay for a new septic system. And I don't think anyone's intending, when they're renting it out, that they're going to ruin their septic system. But most people, I think, unfortunately, aren't thinking about it. So from the owner perspective, if we have a new system design, it's where we really need to discuss with them what are the real or potential uses of their property. And, more at the end, when we talk about regulations, it may be that they will be limited in what they can do with their home based on their septic system. So if they're choosing to rent it, that they think they might rent it out in the future, we certainly would want to think about the septic system in relation to that. When it comes time to actually install the system, discussing optional protections to add to the design, I think we have to take every opportunity in this process to try to educate the owners. So whether that be the designer, the installer, the person who's taking care of it later, understanding that, this may be a system that they were pumping every 3 or 4 years and now need to pump it annually, based on the usage. And this last one, I think, is probably the hardest one, and it's just general wear and tear. And it'll be on things probably besides their septic system, but this increased usage could have impact on their system. And the diagram on the right may not be the system in their yard, but if they have a traditional older style, trench system, we know how those work, right? That eventually, that biomass spreads and that at some point that system reaches its lifespan. And what we're getting at here is when they rent their property, and particularly if it's heavily used, they're going to move from stage 1 to 4 more quickly, which could again affect the longevity of that system. So another thing to discuss with owners is water using device upgrades, and we'll talk more about this in the second presentation, but these are not rental homes that are shown in this image. This is just general water usage in a home. So there are a few areas that property owners could think about ways to minimize flows. The one thing to keep in mind with flows, though, is that if you cut your flow, you do not change your mass floating. The amount of waste in the toilet, which is the easiest way to think about this, is the same, the actual contaminant, regardless of the amount of water. But still, having low flow fixtures does provide for more retention time in some of our units. So as far as devices, the toilet is the number one water user in the home. So again, this picture on the right shows a bathroom, which every realtor would say is in need of a remodel. But right, that's using 5, 7, if it has a leak, even more gallons every time you flush. So if they are upgrading their septic, a new toilet is a couple $100s, right? If they are handy enough to put it in themselves, the plumber generally costs more than the toilet. So that is a significant way to reduce flows on those older style toilets. So looking for the water sense label. Fixing leaking problems. So typically it's a simple gasket that needs to be replaced. Low flow shower heads and faucets can help too, but for people who are living there, that's usually a harder sell. But they do, again, make shower heads in particular now that still have decent pressure but use less water. So those things can all help cut back on flows. The other big issue with rentals that we'll get more into here when we talk about laundry is the washing of clothes. So I'll tell you generally, particularly when I'm on a longer trip, I always look for somewhere that has a washing machine because I want to be able to wash clothes, not take home dirty clothes. You think about you're at the lake or the beach, you're going to have dirty clothes. So if they, again, have the ability to replace older style washing machines, either front loading or efficient top loading washing machines just use a lot less water. In the long run, they pay for themselves because they use less electricity if you're using the dryer as well. The big issue, though, is this last one is when one family or one group of people leave a rental, the challenge is that everything in the home has to be stripped and laundered. And it is really best if that is not done all at one time. So if we're thinking more about an accessory unit on a property, it may be that they can take, if they're there, if they are the owners and not having a cleaning service, they could potentially bring, that stuff back to the house and slowly wash it over the next couple days. If they have a cleaning service, that's a much harder, and that's what I see a lot of them have, is they have someone who comes in, they start the load of laundry when they get there, they're there, and it's just all being done relatively quickly. So we'll come back to this one here. The other thing just to touch on is what is in our washing machine waste. So a lot of the fibers that we are now laundering are not cotton and wool. A lot of them are synthetic fibers. If you think about how soft your sheets are sometimes now, that's not all cotton and wool. And so when we launder things, believe it or not, more comes off in your washer than your dryer. And most of us do not have any sort of lint filter on our washing machine. So choosing a non-agitating washing machine does produce less lint. And this is, in his hand right there is the lint coming out of an aftermarket lint filter. Um, so it's a great addition, but on a rental again could be challenging. So the general filter that you see there in the background can go numerous loads. It depends a little what you're washing and how dirty your clothes are between cleaning. But generally, we don't want things that need maintenance within a rental because now we're relying upon someone to deal with that. But certainly, having an effluent filter, an effluent screen, ideally with an alarm that alerts if there happens to be a high water event, because the other thing you really don't want with rentals is backup. I mean, no one wants backup, but it's even more disastrous if it is with a rental. So there are other options out there. So you'll see two different aftermarket. They do make bags. I've seen recently some research being done about a device you can actually put in the washing machine that might help kind of filter during the washing process. But just as reference, there was a home that collected their lint for 2 years and they dried it. So keep in mind that it was 2 pounds of dry lint, and if it was all plastic, which it is all not, he indicated there was some glitter in there because he happens to have daughters. But the weight of that, if it was all plastic fibers, would be equivalent to 90 plastic water bottles. But keep in mind, they are microfibers. They are tiny plastics, and there is the risk that those can even make it through an effluent screen. And if they make it out to your soil treatment area, soil microbes, again, aren't equipped to degrade plastic components. So in the washing machine, it's certainly better to not have garbage disposals. Most of these homes are either going to have one or not. And generally speaking, people like having garbage disposals because they don't want to put their hand in that sink and grab that gunk. I don't really want to either, but I just do it. Or what I have in that sink is a small strainer that catches it so I can just dump it into my compost bin. So it's just that extra food waste can challenge systems. And I had a friend who happens to also be a regulator in Minnesota, and he started renting out his mother-in-law suite above his garage. And he had a brilliant idea that with every rental, and his were week rentals, based because it was on a lake, and that's how they had it set up. He had the idea that he would give them a pound of bacon from his local meat shop. So, first, everyone likes it. It's a great gift, right? Well, fourth or fifth rental, he gets something through the app saying that their sink was plugged. And he's like, well, and he told me they had a garbage disposal. So we had to go take it apart. And it was a combination of that fat from the bacon with potato peelings had just basically congealed into a giant mess under the sink. So he definitely rethought his bacon idea because we all know that bacon grease shouldn't go down the drain. But now you're talking about, again, we're renting to people who aren't always knowledgeable. And I would say in the city, you don't want to do that either, right? But just thinking about those things. So keep in mind, most people are going to use whatever cleaners and soaps you provide them. So having natural-based cleaners and soaps. I do not recommend using pods. Pods have a basically dissolvable plastic coating around the outside. The other issue is most of the time you don't need as much soap as they want to sell you, and I would rather people be a little bit more judicious in their soap usage. I don't know that that necessarily happens when you have renters where they have to put amount of detergent into something either, but that's kind of a side note because really the real reason with this is because of the plastic component. So here again is just why we aren't a big fan of garbage disposal. So this is again from a very standard engineering textbook. And I just picked the two that stood out to me the most is if a home on average, and these are average data, has a garbage disposal, they are going to be putting more solids and BOD down the drain. It's just that undigested food is going to add a load to their system. So some states and some designers may include extra capacity to deal with some of this challenge, but you just can't necessarily know how people are going to use that. And particularly with rentals, you have another wild card there. The other big challenge with garbage disposals is they grind those solids up into tiny little pieces. Tiny little pieces do not settle out as well. So there is the risk with some of these smaller particles that they will not settle in our primary treatment in our septic tank and are more likely to make their way to downstream components. So related to some of the things we've been talking about is cleaning challenges. And so this is one of the hardest things I think to actually get an accurate information on, in that I think some people, when they start to rent, don't really know how they will plan to rent it out. Generally speaking, people would prefer to have weekly rentals because every time you have a new renter, you have interactions, you have just a workload associated with that. So certainly week or month rentals are fabulous. But depending on where they live and the market, they may be doing weekends. And I've actually stayed at a rental where I stayed for a night, right? So what that means is when I left, right, they again had to wash my sheets, wash all my towels. So that is the challenge. So the image here on the right, Devil's Lake is actually in North Dakota, and this is not an egregious example, but this is something we're going to talk more about, is that it's a 3-bedroom home that sleeps 10. Very common, right? So we would say a typical 3-bedroom home sleeps 6, right? 2 people per bedroom. But what you'll often see is multiple beds in bedrooms. You'll see pull-out couches. You'll see air mattresses. One of them even, like, you can had a teepee outside, right? Tents, you name it. So people are looking at maximizing that number because sometimes people are looking to have a group of people get together and split the costs. So, and certainly if you have a lot of people, that adds to your cleaning load. So questions to consider for the homeowner is, are they doing their laundry on or off site? How many loads will there be at each turnover? Do they provide extra sheets and towels? I know once we were staying at a beach location and they had more beach towels than anyone would ever need. And, I'm sure some of you, if any of you have teenagers, sometimes know some people think a towel should be used once and then it needs to be washed. That can create a lot of laundry. So another challenge is the type of cleaning products being used. Certainly, since COVID, we have seen a lot more sanitizers on the market. One of my least favorite one is actually laundry detergent that is sanitizing. And what we really want to avoid as a just kind of general rule of thumb is quaternary ammonia, which shows up on labels of disinfectants as ammonium chloride, not always labeled as quats. Just an incredibly strong disinfectant. So when it comes to actually education, certainly the challenge here is that we are generally working hopefully with the owner of the property, but not the end user. The end users, again, who's going to rent that facility. So what is suggested is there were some great documents that were developed several years ago during Septic Smart Week by EPA, and you could certainly customize these, but they're very high level, which is what most people need. So some of these rentals now have either a physical book or they have an electronic book of things to know about the property, like favorite restaurants or how to turn on the air conditioner, whatever it might be. Well, putting these documents in there is just another awareness, and then potentially also putting these somewhere in the home, very obvious. So it tells them again, they're on a septic system, and tips on what to put and what to not put down the drain. They also made some tent cards, which is something, again, that I think is something you put right by the sink and right by the toilet. They make really cute signs out there if you go on Amazon too that can be hung, just alerting people that they're on a septic system. As far as more managed or education opportunities for the actual owner of the property, when they get that new septic system, if we're at that design stage, there should be a management plan or some sort of operating manual, ideally that is targeting the owner, not the actual service provider. That document is usually super technical and no property owner is going to understand that or want to, read through that. So something that's more, more educational for a homeowner. So the one you see in front of you is the one that recently NAURA developed. So it's national level. I'm sure, or assuming within Washington state, you might have something that is more Washington specific. But this one is meant to kind of be broad and kind of work everywhere. It's online as a flip book. So it can be emailed out to people. It's electronic. So it's a nice resource if you want to be able to send people something like, please read this, right? And I know that's the challenge, is getting people to read things. We also made it into an online course. So if you have special owners, and every once in a while you run into someone like that who may want to learn a lot about their recent large investment on their property, there is a free homeowner course that's on the online platform. All right, so with that, we're now going to move into talking about what are the things we should think about during design when we're dealing with short-term rentals. So I think this is the biggest one, and that is, what flow should we use? So most of our regulations, again, have used bedrooms, right? We're going to use the number of bedrooms, and I think with these rentals, that is often not our best number. And I still want to know that. I would still be asking the question about how many bedrooms. I then want to know the number of beds that they're going to provide. So to me, that includes obvious beds, but it also could include pull-out beds, air mattresses, bunk houses, whatever it might be. And what we're really trying to get at is the true maximum occupancy. And the easiest way to say this is going back to that snapshot I showed, is if they wanted to say how many people can sleep here, what would that number be? Because that is the number we want to design the septic system for. You also do want to check in with peak usage, and that is, will this facility be used at all for events? So I've stayed twice at basically properties where weddings or large events were held, where lots of people stayed. One used to be a grouse hunting establishment. It had basically a small lodge with which looked like a commercial kitchen, cabins, and then they said you can set up as many tents as you want. That would have been hard to get it, and it was on a septic. It was working while I was there, is all I can tell you about that. And another one was, again, a facility where they regularly allow people to have small weddings. So that usage to me is outside of normal, but you want to ask that. And I would say most short-term rentals that I see prohibit parties and say you can't do that, but then there are some where they're just really set up for that. So in those instances, that might be where we're going to want to incorporate time dosing. And that might be something we even want to do going down to that listing number, but those will be things we'll want to think about. And certainly, you all being regulators for the most part are going to want to also think about, how are you going to approach this? Is it something you have policies? Is it in your ordinance? Like, how will you deal with this? And maybe some of you are already doing that. So we want to remind the client that septic regulations assume 2 people per bedroom. So if there's going to be more than 2 people, we should be sizing based on people and not on bedrooms. So the recommendation here is what many state codes use, which is 75. I know some states and some designers have gone down to, for instance, 50 gallons per person. And certainly we know that as you have multiple people in a house, 75 gallons ends up being a pretty high number per person. But if you want safety factor built into your design, flow is sometimes the way to do it. So if you happen to be out there because the property had a problem, so you're replacing the system because it malfunctioned or failed, that's where you really want to think about, what is their current flow? What should the next flow be? Because it may have been under designed for the usage. So home monitoring is another interesting thing that is gotten so much more common, right? I've heard it. You should almost always assume you're on camera when you're on someone's property now. So clients, so people renting sometimes will also not be honest about how many people are showing up. I'll go back to my county friend. They say the maximum occupancy of their facility is 6 people. That's all you can have. Some will even charge as you add people. In either case, you can sometimes have people that will show up with 8 people or 10 people or 12 people, and they're just planning to sleep on the couches or whatever it might be. So that is a nice thing if the owners are absentee, is that they can actually see how many people are on their property. Sometimes the neighbors will see it as well when 6 cars pull up. So some of that can be self-reporting, particularly if you're in areas of high visibility. But again, having cameras can help minimize this issue. So this is kind of outside the discussion, but I think it's worth bringing up because it is coming up more and more, is that people are having RV pads. So it could be with a rental that they'll have a hookup as well. So this could be that property owners may want to dispose of their own waste in their septic system. And as I mentioned, it is just getting more common. This is actually a portable tank that's designed that you can hook up your RV to it and you can wheel it over to the septic tank and enter it. It could go anywhere, but if you're on a rural property or an area not without sewer, it's probably going into a septic system. So the concerns, if people are considering this even at their home, is deodorizers such as formaldehyde are still available. Formaldehyde is not something we want to be putting into our septic systems. The rate of discharge. So you're talking about a decent amount of gallons going into a tank all at one time, and also the strength. Most people are not taking long showers or doing laundry, so that waste strength tends to be pretty concentrated. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but and this report is on our website, but we did a study just looking at some of the commonly found sanitizers on the market. And what you'll notice is the red numbers are the ones that were concerning. The second one, the Aquachem, has formaldehyde as an active ingredient. You'll see a couple of them run, and this was just the product, no waste, no human waste, just the RV product and water. They ran a little acidic, and it's hard to know if a little of that would buffer out if we had human waste. I think it would. You'll also see that one on the far right, the BioPal, also is using phosphoric acid, and that's not something that's a very high phosphorus level. And our septic systems only have limited capacity to remove phosphorus, so we do not want to overburden them with extra phosphorus. So again, formaldehyde should be avoided. If you're really thinking about more RV dump stations, we need to try to educate users, but we need more data around this whole topic. This was just a snapshot. So other design options to consider on the pre-treatment side, so leaving the home, is having a clean out outside the home, which is again common in many regulations. Increasing the septic tank capacity is kind of cheap insurance to help mitigate some of the challenges. Having a larger effluent screen. This is not a time I would want a 4-inch screen. I'd want to be going with a larger / moving up to almost commercial size screens. It's just more time between service visits and having a high water alarm associated with that, so we know if cleaning is needed. If the tank needs a pump tank, this is another time I would not be going with the minimum size pump tank. 2 reasons. One would be reserve capacity if the pump goes out. The other would be is you could then potentially use that pump tank as a time dose tank to mitigate particularly maybe some of those laundry surges or just surges by the users in general. But that does require then a different panel as well. You could consider providing space for future advanced pre-treatment. So if it was a system that only had a septic tank before the soil and we're worried about longevity, we could, if we're not going to put pre-treatment in up front, we could consider allowing space for that to happen in the future, or even potentially add soil dispersal capacity. If it was a property that could have gravity, consider pressure distribution. Pressure distribution just helps spread water out from day one and helps minimize the formation of a thick limiting biomat. If you are using pressure, this is the time. I wouldn't be choosing 1/8-inch perforations if I had a choice. Just the smaller the hole, the more likely it is to plug. And when we're worried about high usage, I'd rather have slightly larger holes. And also planning for slightly more distal head can also help. So designing for 2, 3, 4, 5 feet ahead will help keep some of those, is more likely to keep those perforations open. So on the flow measurement side, from my perspective, all of these rentals should have a method to actually track and calculate flow. So if they're on public water, someone's recording that data. Typically, the users only get monthly flow data. If that's all you get, it's better than nothing, but I would rather see daily flow data, trying to understand the peaks in flow in particular, because we really do design septics on peak. We are not designing on average, right? The septic system needs to work and function the day they use 600 gallons, even though most days they only use 2. So water meters, there are now more automated options. Historically, most water meters are in people's homes and it requires someone to write a number down. But in my second talk today, we'll talk a little bit more about the use of some of the more modern water meters. If they happen to have a water softener, some water softeners, the more technically advanced ones track water usage. But again, now you're talking about something in their home. So often what we've done is either using automated or using some sort of cycle counter or running time clock. And again, if it's tied into telemetry or Wi-Fi where we can get our hands on that data, it's much more accessible. And very few systems now that I interact with anyway have anything other than that cycle counter and that running time clock. And that's useful, but it requires some work to get from there to how many gallons per day they're using. Which again, we'll touch on more later. All right, so with that, we'll move into, those were things to think about during design. Now we're actually going to installing. So if the design was done at state minimums, I think the installer has an opportunity here again to try to educate that owner about some things we could add to facilitate longevity. Making sure if that all manholes are to grade. So particularly, let's say they were adding on to an existing system and they had an old septic tank with buried lids. Let's make the whole system easy to service. Make sure that the landscaping on their property is avoiding any sort of stormwater runoff towards the tanks, the treatment area in general. And ideally, your soil, any sort of inspection pipes are above grade or at grade and protected from damage. We see commonly that at some of these rentals, they have lawn services that come in to do their mowing because they're absentee owners. And I think I don't know if it's a bigger risk, but I would say it's a slightly bigger risk that they're going to hit things. And if they hit them, they may not be that inclined to fix them. So if you have, again, a pressure distribution system with a clean out, right, the last thing we'd want is that clean out to be exposed because now we can have a mini Old Faithful in their yard. So access lids during the installation time, this is certainly another time to discuss secondary protection. So like you see here in the picture, no child can fall through that. So too routinely, I think we hear stories about small people usually falling into these tanks because we all know there's 4 to 5 feet of liquid there, which is enough for someone to drown. I recently did hear about a story in Texas, though, where the tanks are 8 feet in the ground and you're in that tank, even getting out of those tanks is difficult, getting someone out of those tanks. So I think these are a great addition. I hope as time goes on, more and more state regulations require these at the time of install, but we still have all these existing infrastructure out there. So they're great add-on to systems. So the soil treatment area is something we want to protect certainly during the time of installation, but also after. So letting visitors know one way or another. So there's a sign on the left here, right, telling people to stay off the drain field. If you happen to be in a part of Washington that gets snow, even in winter, this is true because when you drive on snow, you push out the airspace in the snow, and that's what actually helps insulate the system. So the soil treatment area really needs to be off limit to renters with no exception. And I don't mean walking, I mean any sort of traffic. So vehicles, boats, RVs, whatever it might be. So a sign can help, but sometimes that maybe you might need something a little bit more aggressive. If it's the nice flat area and an otherwise pretty full parcel. So that could be curbs, shrubs, fencing, something to keep traffic off of that. So when it comes to pump alarms and controls, here's where remote monitoring is a huge benefit. And people are getting more used to having, if you think about the Ring cameras, right? Like for a lot of people, that's like, it's a no-brainer. It seems with septic systems, we're not still quite there. There's a company out of Texas I was talking with, and they're like, we're planning to be the Nest thermometer of the septic world. So you'd have an app on your phone and you would know, you'd get an alert if your alarm's going off. And it would tell you how many gallons per day you're using. I mean, I think those are awesome. I don't know how many people are willing to pay and care. I get that that might be, I might be unique in thinking that's a really cool feature. But Wi-Fi, and almost all of these have Wi-Fi, right? I stayed at one in the middle of nowhere. We were actually in Chile, near Patagonia, and it had it, and it had Starlink because people want a way to communicate. So even on some of these really rural spots, you will be able to have a Wi-Fi enabled panel. And you can also sell it from the perspective of protecting their home, because again, if a septic system backs up into the home, you can be talking about tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars of damage, depending on what it's backing up into, particularly if it backs up into their home. It isn't a bad idea to have a lock on the panel. There is the risk of alarms going off, particularly if they're not tied to Wi-Fi, of people silencing those alarms. And we really don't want people getting into their panels who, particularly it's not even their home if it's a rental. All right, so with that, we'll move into management considerations. So if these are actively used short-term rentals, these are sites that are very likely going to need more frequent visits. So during these visits, we can be checking the flows, seeing again what is their average daily flow. If the system looks like it's being used heavily, we may want to sample it to determine how concentrated is that waste stream. You know, some rentals have a lot of food prep in them. If you add a lot of food prep with a garbage disposal and lots of users, you know, they may be putting more waste down the drain than we typically design for. So sampling for things like BOD and TSS might give you a way to actually quantify that. Checking the solids levels in tanks more frequently. So if you're regularly there, but this is something again that I see a lot of tanks when a service provider shows up, they show up with a vac truck, they clean out the tanks. It's super useful to actually know how full they were to determine what is the right maintenance frequency. I mean, I had an owner of some cabins say, you know, should I be pumping them once a year? And I said, well, you know, you could, but you could also ask your service provider when they're out at that year interval, how full were the tanks? Rentals are very different in how they're used. Some of them have people that are kind of coming and going and not doing a lot of food prep, and others, you know, may have a lot of users and a lot. So there isn't a one size fits all as far as how often. They should always be checking the pump tank. I was just last week in South Carolina looking at a bunch of systems, and we saw a lot of pump tanks with like a foot of sludge in them. And these were after aerobic treatment units. And some of the septic tanks had been pumped. It was evident that there wasn't a lot of sludge in the septic tank, but over the years there had been carryover to the pump tank, and we really don't want to be pumping sludge out to our soil treatment area. Also having pressurized laterals serviced. So this is something that is sometimes also overlooked unless it's required, is that, you know, we have a lot of cleanouts out there, but generally when I see lines flushed and cleaned is when there's a problem. And that is a little too late. And it's not to say I would do it then too, but if we're proactively cleaning those laterals, we'll have better distribution over the life of the system. So as far as then checking the soil treatment area, we all know gravity systems are designed to be ponded. And you can probably see in this picture, it's a relatively shallow system. So we see some nice green strips. If you have a distribution box loading that system, the amount of ponding in our system should be uniform. If you have drop boxes instead, it should be progressively less as you're going kind of down, stepping down through the system. But we can also check, like, with a system like this, some people might be worried, like, well, it's green in my yard. Well, if it's a dry year, that makes sense. But with some systems like this, as they're approaching the end of their life, if you do a boring, or sometimes you'll even walk and it'll be a little squishy over the top, or you can do a boring right in that nice green grass and you'll actually see a biomat coming up above. And that again would indicate that you have a system that's probably near the end of its useful life. So again, this shows uneven strips. So these two pictures were taken in the same neighborhood during a dry time period. The one on the left is what we would more expect to see, which is kind of and these use a distribution box with the idea of uniform distribution across the area. Um, and then on the right, though, you can see the same picture where we see it looks like only on the ends are we getting water to those trenches. And in that case, what we would really need to do is, access that distribution box and determine why we don't see even distribution across the system. So if instead you're talking about a pressure dose system, so the picture here on the right, if I were in person, I'd ask you guys, what do you think's buried under there? What it is a chamber. So the reason why there's no grass across the top strip is that's where the plastic dome is and no water can get out there. But the reason why you can tell it's pressurized is the water's literally squirting out the side of the louvers. So it's a kind of nice way to see that distribution. So if you have a pressure dose system, we do not expect to see ponding within that system. But a nice kind of test is to turn the pump on, deliver a normal dose while you're there, and see does the water go away. Ideally, again, that should be, something that goes away relatively quickly. If you had a pressure dose elevated system, such as, a mound system, you can actually bore underneath the sand to determine, how thick that biomat is. And if you see sand that's relatively dry, but you have a lot of ponding in your sand, it tells you that that biomat may be getting too thick. If you have advanced treatment on the site, here's where having we're going to have a certified and licensed service provider who's taking care of that. So this would be a system that I don't have to be a service provider to see that there's a problem. So if anytime we have effluent on the surface, anyone who's taking care of these should always be trained on how to do proper operation maintenance of the unit, checking a management plan to determine exactly what needs to happen. The wetness signs are always one sign, but also taking samples if needed, looking at the effluent, if it still smells like sewage, it's probably not working. If it's not clear, that's also, a general sign of maintenance needs. So. All right, so the last topic here is what do we do from a regulatory perspective? And maybe at the end of this, we can talk about what you're all doing in Washington to kind of address some of these issues. So I think the first one is, do we permit based on the maximum occupancy? And if we do, which is definitely what I suggested, how many gallons per person? And you can pick that number. I think picking the number is probably the easiest part. The harder part is how do you enforce it? So we can say that this is a design flow, but then the second question is, are you going to require that flow data be submitted to prove they're staying under those flows? How do you actually then control how they list their properties? So I know some people are going to actually licensing rentals, and I've certainly stayed at numerous ones where I've seen something on the wall that says, that this is a licensed facility, and that certainly that licensing can then incorporate how many people can stay in within that. But then the next question is, how are they actually, listing it? How are they advertising it? There's numerous listing agencies now. I've mentioned Airbnb, but they're one of 10, give or take, ways that people can rent out their properties. So that is a challenge to stay on top of. I know of some of our counties that are more active counties that have a lot of rentals, and they can barely stay up with it. So one of them told me they found a company that actually pulls all that data for them and gives them like a monthly report of all of the vacation home rentals within their county. So they know if someone new pops up on the list, they can then follow up with them to make sure, because their county does require that the septic be sized for the actual rental. So the licensing, I mentioned that. The other thing that can go with licensing is that they have a legal system. So we know we have a lot of systems out there that don't meet current standards. And so if they're going to be renting it out, it may be a time to say, you can't do it unless you have a good septic system. So So the next one can be controversial depending on how many holding tanks are in your jurisdiction, but some people have prohibited rentals from being on holding tanks. And so, because I have a few minutes, I'm going to tell you my favorite story about short-term rentals. And that is the first time I remember staying at a short-term rental. It was around 15 years ago, and it was in York, Maine. And I went with my extended family. So there were 15 of us, and we rented this giant, giant old house. And it had room for us. Like it wasn't like it was over occupancy or anything like that. But we show up and we pull into the driveway and they're all getting out unpacking. And I like sniff a little and I'm like, what is that smell? And you know what it was, right? It was sewage. So while they're all unpacking, I walk around the back of the house and I see a 4-inch pipe and I see wastewater running out of the 4-inch pipe. So this was before apps and all of that. So I literally think we had to call up because it was through some sort of like property management group. And they're like, well, we'll reach out to our service guy and get back to you. And she calls me up and she's like, well, actually, you're on a holding tank. And I'm like, a what? So it was like a like 6 or 7 bedroom house. And she said, well, we'll try to have someone out tomorrow. And I'm like, we've been traveling all day. People want to shower. If we shower, sewage is running on the surface. And she's like, well, I'll see what I can do. My next call was to a friend of mine who I knew the regulations there. And I asked how those facilities were licensed and how it worked and all of it. And he told me that they are, in fact, licensed. And if this was reported, they would lose their license or certainly have a violation. So I called back. And what I can tell you is the septic system, the holding tank didn't surface the whole rest of the time I was there. But it still was a bit disheartening because when the pumper came out, the service provider, I asked him, well, how does he know? Because there was nothing at the surface. It was literally a 4-inch pipe. There was no alarm, there was no anything. And he said, well, I either get a call or if I'm driving by, I stop in. And I'm like, that does not sound like a good plan for a 6-bedroom rental facility. So while I was there, we also talked to the neighbors who also had noticed this issue. So who knows what happened after I left, but so if you're going to have holding tanks, certainly those are systems that I would want alarms on. I definitely, if it were me, I'd want telemetry on them so the service provider knows when the alarm's going off. So, and the reason why I say it's controversial is there are parts of the US that have a lot of properties on holding tanks, and to tell people they can't rent out their homes may not be politically an option because it sometimes can be viewed as a taking, right? That you're not allowing people to use their properties. But so the last one on this slide is if it's a new system, do you consider oversizing components? So I always like to remind people our state regulations are minimum codes. They are meant to meet to apply to what I would think of as a minimum house. So when you start seeing houses that have, multiple kitchens or more than one washer and dryer and things along those lines, we're also really not talking about multiple homes. Or if they have 10 people in a 3-bedroom house, that is not a normal 3-bedroom house. So the question though sometimes is, do you start with the flow number? Because if you move up, you say it's a 3-bedroom house, but we're going to use 600 gallons, let's say. Well, then we need to be designing our components based on 600 and let go that it was a 3-bedroom house. So just kind of thinking about how you'll deal with that from a regulatory standpoint. So certainly flow control with time dosing is a great idea, either before advanced treatment or before the soil. I mean, I'm a big fan of pumps and systems, and I know a lot of property owners aren't, but if you have a pump already, upsizing that tank, upsizing that control panel, and I just mean more capacity there, that the panel's smarter to be able to control those flows can really help that system work better over the long term. So it is recommended that the system be operated on an operating permit. This would allow you the ability to require that flow data to be submitted. Hopefully with that flow data, you can also get some use or occupancy data. And the sampling, again, would be something that's only required if you're concerned about the waste strength or if it had an advanced pretreatment unit. that might be required to just to prove that that component is working. The other challenge I think that comes up from a regulatory standpoint is there are numerous people who don't like short-term rentals and want to use the septic system as the reason why. I just had this about an RV campground actually, and they're like, they're designing the RV campground septic wrong, and we're opposed to having an RV park in our neighborhood. And I don't live there. It's up to them if they want to have an RV park in their backyard. But sometimes people more just don't want rentals in their community or in their neighborhood or their neighbors. And I can get it, right? Sometimes they can be loud, a lot of traffic, all those other things, noise complaints, all of those things can be issues. The other thing I think about if they happen to have a private well is now we have a private well that people are using. So that's another kind of thing to think about. But to me, this septic is one piece of the issues around some of these short-term rental issues. And sometimes it can be the scapegoat. And again, I want people to have good septic systems, but we need to work with the other regulatory issues that come up and see, is it about the septic or is it because they don't want rentals? And there are areas that limit how many rentals can be in a given area or may prohibit rentals altogether. I've seen HOAs do that. So there are ways to limit that, but having a good septic certainly should be part of it, but not always the driving force behind some of these issues. So before we see if there's any questions out there around this topic, some of you may know that I write for the Installer and Pumper, and I try to write useful articles that are a bit scientific, but not over the top. And so I also think that some of these are useful to hand to property owners. So this specific topic and this presentation came out of someone asking me, like, how do we educate the people we deal with every day that have we're replacing their septic system and they don't understand some of the issues. So a lot of the stuff I covered in this presentation is covered in this article. So, and that came from someone like you all. So if you ever wish there was an article about a topic, please send me an email. The installer by its name, you think, isn't just installation, it's more design and installation, where the pumper is certainly more service focused on the service side of our industry. And my hardest thing every month is to think of a new topic to write about. They come fast and frequent, so that I have to write another one. So with that, Roger, I don't know, I see your face, that's why I'm picking on you. I don't know if there's any questions in the chat that we could address or anything.
So are you able to see the question and answer tab?
Yes, I can bring it up here.
So there is one in there.
Oh, I see more let's see more Q&A. Yeah. Okay, so the question is that you guys, but I'll just read it because I need to read it anyway. A homeowner recently said a friend of theirs was using Blue Land eco-friendly detergent tablets for the laundry machine and dishwasher. When the tank was pumped, there was a thick layer of cellulose. I would have to look into it as well. So when I hear the word cellulose, I mean, I'm thinking, I don't know if you're referring to toilet paper. I mean, so paper products. So you could Maddie, you could probably just unmute yourself. But I don't know if that's what you're referring to, because the only other thing when I see a lot of paper products or cellulose, the questions I generally ask then are more about what kind of paper products they're using. So I'm not a fan of quadruple quilted anything. So double quilted I'm okay with, but after that, those fibers tend to be pretty resilient to natural breakdown. And that's what we're relying upon. So toilet paper in general would be better. If you really want the answer, it'd be better if we all had bidets, but that's not what we're going to do in the US anytime soon. But we are designing that the toilet paper needs to break down. So the toilet paper, are they putting Kleenex, other sorts of fibers, certainly things that are sanitizing wipes that should not be called flushable wipes, can persist in a system if they're putting them down the drain, and they have plastic fibers in them, so it's not even all paper. So, so those are my general thoughts, but I'm not aware of that specific detergent.
Okay, yeah. Sorry, I think I just unmuted myself, so hopefully you can hear me. Um, that makes sense about the toilet paper and things like that. I think they were um thinking that it was due to those detergent pods. I looked up the ingredients and there's microcrystalline cellulose, and I think that the idea was that that cellulose that's in the tablets to kind of hold them together added a lot to the um scum and sludge layers. So yeah, that's all that I was wondering, if there's anything about those sort of tablet soaps that we knew about. But it definitely could have been from something else like their toilet paper. So I just wasn't sure if there was anything about that specific type of detergent. But thanks for the info.
Yeah, but if I saw it, I would tell them to stop using it too. I mean, if there's cellulose as an ingredient, the word, and something being labeled eco-friendly means absolutely nothing. Right. That's the bummer, is you can put a label on anything. And I generally do encourage people to buy things like, if all else being equal, if it says it's biodegradable, it says it's eco, but nobody regulates that, unfortunately. So it's just advertising. So there's no way to know, but I have not heard of that specific issue. So I can't specifically address it, but if I had problems, I would stop using something, because sometimes I tell people they almost need to go on like the septic version of an elimination diet when they have problems, is try to figure out what they're using in their home that's causing, and I hear this a lot with screens, that people have an effluent filter and it's plugging and they can't figure out why. Is And again, you always look for all the obvious things, and if it's none of the obvious things, then it often could be related to a specific product or activity in their home. And what I generally find is most homeowners think what they are doing is absolutely normal. They don't really, they have a hard time seeing an activity or a hobby or a habit they have. Like the last one I saw, I'm like, is he a home brewer? It looks like grain on his screen. And the answer was no, he wasn't. So we're still trying to figure it out. But yeah.
Edward, I see that you have your hand raised. I wanted to see if you had a question or if that was an accident. You can unmute if you'd like.
No, I didn't have a question. Thank you.
Okay. Yep. All right.
All right. Well, if there's nothing else, I can go into my second talk here. All right, so these are a little related, but this one will go a lot more in depth. So we did talk some about flow in relation to short-term rentals, but this talk again is really meant to describe the methods to collect flow data. So we'll talk some about homes, but also getting more into commercial. So many of you probably don't know, but the person who started our program in Minnesota in 1973, his name was Roger McMyer. And I once was giving a talk at our state fair, and it's a very popular state fair, and decided that speaking on the mall about septic systems at the state fair is the only time I did it, because no one goes to the fair to learn about septic systems. But it was interesting. I got done with my little spiel on the stage, and an old guy walks up to me, and it was Roger McMyer, and I'd never met him. He was like the guy who started, like the godfather of our program, right? And he's like, "You did a nice job, but I really wish you'd mention that people need a flow meter." So it was like his burning issue. And I like to describe it as like, who would drive a car without an odometer? And someone in the room usually says, I had one, but that's how I know when to change my oil. It's like the most obvious way that I can manage my car. And if you think about it, cars don't need to have odometers, right? You could check your oil, right, and see when it's dirty. But really, the auto industry figured out how to get us to maintain our vehicles. And we, with septic systems, I wish we could do a better job at educating our users. And so this flow number really does matter. It matters from the design standpoint all the way through when we're taking care of it. Is how is the system being used really helps me understand the system. So, all right. So what we're going to talk about is how much water are we actually using? And then we'll talk about options for determining flows for homes and commercial businesses. Mixed use commercial is where it really gets really tough. You know, you think about a strip mall, how will you set the design flow for a strip mall? Good luck. That's what I would like to say about that. Is all I think you can do, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, is really look at what they're proposing for users and put flow and waste strength limitations in a permit and say there's a change in use. We have to reassess if those numbers are still right, because that can be really challenging. And then we'll talk about how do we then use those flows when we're managing systems. And I would say that that is the area I also think we really need to get better as an industry. Is I see a lot of design or a lot of service reports that they'll have the cycle counter number or they'll have the elapsed time meter, but they won't have actually calculated the flow because it takes work to do that. But that's the only way I actually know then what's going through the system. So first, looking at how much water we're using. This is a picture I took while traveling. You know, not everyone's used to toilets as we are, so I thought it was kind of funny. So as far as water use, the last time we collected good data on this came out in a report in 2016. So this study is periodically done in the US, not for septic systems. It's actually done for large water and wastewater utilities. So they want to know how much water they need to provide and how much wastewater is going to come back. But it has some really useful data in it on single family home usage. And that's really what this report is based on, is it looks at both indoor and outdoor single family home water usage across kind of the upper part of North America. So US and a little into Canada. I'm not showing the outside water use data because that doesn't really impact septic systems, but they do also do that because if you're a water utility, you would need to know that. So the goal of this study, which I mentioned is done about every 15 years, is to collect and analyze indoor end uses of water. It's also looking at changes. So that when the 2016 study came out, they made a lot of correlations to the last time the study was published, which was 1999. Another goal was to identify variations in water use by each fixture or appliance. So at these sites, they put in very sophisticated water meters that are able to actually detect when it's a toilet flush or when it's laundry. So it's the meter along with some software that helps recognize those. And it also will, for instance, will detect a leak if there's a slow amount of water moving all the time. So as part of this, they look at how could we conserve more water. And the last thing, which I think is also interesting, is determining the factors influencing the changes, if we're seeing changes in water usage. So before I read this study, if you had asked me, and I'm going to go to this slide, is if you compared water usage in Chicago to, let's say, Northern California, who would be more, would people in California use less water, for instance, than people in Chicago? My gut would have said yes, or we could pick Texas or Arizona, some dry state, some state that regularly has droughts. I would have thought that people might be more conservative in their water usage. And thinking about inside versus outside, but I even thought inside in people's homes that have regular droughts might be more aware. And so it was important. You'll see they had a pretty broad distribution of locations they got the data from because they do want it overall to represent the US. So they did look at, are there differences based on where the water use was occurring. So the study method is they had a random representative selection of single family home customers. They got highly detailed information on water usage. They had the demographics of who and the age and all that of the people living in the home. They did some of that social science, which asked them about their attitudes. So that's really getting at, do people in California shut off their faucet when they're brushing their teeth, and people in, water rich states let it run? Does that factor into water usage? They also got the physical nature, so they know exactly like the type of appliances and what the outdoor landscape looked like as well. So you can see this data is now getting a little old, so 2010 to 2013. So it's almost time to do the study again. We're not quite there, but we will be soon. So 23 different utilities. So they got the billing data with surveys from 2,000 homes. The actual detailed water meters were put into 762 homes. And they had a smaller set of homes, 94, where they looked at hot versus cold water usage. And if you are somewhere that's cold, it is kind of interesting to think about how much of the water that comes down the drain is actually warm water versus, just regular water. So this is kind of I showed a similar version of this pie chart before, but we're going to look a little bit more in depth about some of these usages. And so again, we see that toilet, again, this is the 2016 data, is still the #1 user, but we can see the shower is getting pretty darn close. The clothes washer and the faucets right behind, right? Then the light, kind of that aqua blue color, is our leaks, which is always an astounding number. And these are single family homes. These are not, these are not commercial. So that's still to me, a relatively large number. And you can see the rest are pretty small. Other might be things like if they have a water softener that's discharging to the system, then we have the bathtub and dishwasher being pretty small. So I just did want to touch on looking at that black water versus gray water. So black water includes wastewater from food preparations and toilets, where gray water is the wastewater from all the other sources. Black water contains higher concentrations of nitrogen and human pathogens, and it decomposes slower than gray water. Traditionally, systems have combined black water and gray water. But occasionally they are treated separately. And when I say occasionally, I do think it's getting more common, but still relatively uncommon, to think about treating them separately. So gray water with treatment can be used for irrigation, toilet flushing, or other uses where you don't have to have potable drinking water. But that still requires some treatment, because you can think about when you flush the toilet, you're still aerosolizing waste and things along those lines. So looking at that black versus gray water, we have historically said, that about half of it is black and half of it's gray. But I think to some degree we're seeing that shift as we get more and more low flow toilets. The amount of toilet volume flushing. From an organic standpoint, this is more than accurate, right? That more than half of the organics are probably coming from the toilet in the kitchen. And this study didn't look at that issue, but that is an important thing when we say these 50%, that is more about the actual water usage versus the actual organic loading. So that being said, gray water accounts for about 1/2, or I would say increasingly more than 1/2. And gray water is easier to reuse due to its reduced solids and pathogens. And I think as designers, and sometimes even as regulators, we should be thinking about the opportunities for reuse. The challenge, though, again, is the amount of gray water produced at a residential level will exceed toilet flushing. It'll far exceed it. I know of a state park where that was the idea, is we'll take, the shower water, we'll treat the shower water, we'll store it, and we'll use it for toilet flushing. Well, their problem is they actually had to release the treated water to the septic system because it wasn't safe for surface discharge, because they couldn't use it all. They had more gray water when they needed. The other thing that I think we do sometimes need to remind people about gray water, it is not clean. Right? So when we look at what's in gray water, there's bits of people, right? Us, soap, chemicals, water, right? We are dirty. Our clothes are dirty. So we have soil, sweat, detergents, bleach. So gray water still has a risk to public health and the environment, but it's that the risk is lower and, again, maybe easier to treat for reuse. The challenge you are left with is a pretty concentrated black water stream though, which has its own kind of treatment challenges, which is a whole kind of another topic in itself, but just wanted to bring these ideas up. So more getting into the actual flow numbers here. So in 1999, the average household was using 177 gallons, and in the 2016 study, that dropped to 138 gallons per day per house, which was a 22% reduction, in those what ended up being 17 years. So you can kind of clearly see on the right where we saw the big reductions, right? So the toilet and the washing machine were our big reductions. Small reductions in showers, faucets, leaks, others. The bathtub is the only number that went up, and it's still, again, that's 3.6 gallons because that's averaged across all the homes. And all of the usage. And why did that number go up? I think it's just a few of those giant bathtubs out there, right? That, otherwise it doesn't really necessarily make sense. So they took that same data I just showed and they divided it by the number of people in the home. The number of people in the home between these two studies was not significantly different. So the reductions we're seeing are not based on the number of people. But what you'll notice is we went from about 70 gallons per person to about 60 gallons per person. So that was an overall 15% reduction. And the chart on the right looks very similar, right? So the clothes washer was actually the biggest change between these two studies on a percentage basis. So there was a 36% reduction in the amount of water used to wash clothes. So it went from 15 gallons per day per person to about 10 gallons per person. And you can see why in 1999, 2% of the survey respondents reported having a high efficiency clothes washer, and now we're at 2/3. It's interesting to me that this is not a mandated change like toilets, right? You can't buy 5-gallon flush toilets. This is just the consumers buying the products they want that are driving us towards using less water. You can see though that this number is going to go down because in the 1999 study, it averaged 41 gallons per load. And in 2016, we were down to 31. But we know there are many washing machines that use significantly less. So there's still some 40 gallons out there and you can still buy them and they still are cheaper. So, but I would still suspect we'll see this number go down over the years. Interestingly, in the study, the number of loads per day did not change or per person. So people, again, are doing the same amount of laundry. It's just that their washing machines are more efficient. So the second biggest change was on toilet flushing. It fell by 23%. So you'll see we went from 9% of homes having a flush under 2 gallons to now we're at 37%. The average toilet flush volume decreased from about 3.7 gallons to 2.6 gallons per flush averaged across all these homes. But probably not surprising, the number of times we flushed did not change. So in these two studies, the average person flushed 5 times per day at home. I am a little curious. I feel like there are more people working from home than when this study was done, if we'll actually see this number go up slightly. I work from home about half the time, so I know I flush the toilet more at home than I used to, and I think some of us do. It will depend on the household, but you're thinking about this on an average basis across the United States and Canada. So I think we could potentially see that number rise if the study were redone. So the leaks in this study, about 5% of the study homes had no leakage, which is kind of frightening because that means 95% had some leakage. 63% of the homes leaked some, but not very much. So we're basically saying 2/3 of the homes, not a big deal. But unfortunately, the other third had high leakage rates. So somewhere in between 10 and 600 gallons per day. So what that kind of tells you is like those big leaks are generally our problems, where the small leaks aren't as big of an issue. So kind of to explain this one, and this is the important thing that we need to think about with septic system, is what this chart shows is the percent of indoor water use accounted for in each bin of users. So in this view, the percent of the total indoor use accounted for by the members of the larger bin. So maybe it'll make sense. If we go across the bottom, if you go to 50 gallons, so that's 50 gallons, 2% of the homes in this study use 50 gallons. The total percentage then is 2%. So now if I go to 100, 15% of the homes use 100 gallons per day, which and then the 17 below that is the total, right, that are covered at 100 gallons or less. And you can see what I circled is our most common is from 100 to 300 gallons per day, right? That's the kind of top of this curve. And that is one of the challenges is if you look at a house, can you tell if they're going to be 100 or a 300? And we also don't design for who's living in that house at that time. I mean, there definitely was data collected in this study that shows that newer homes with plumbing systems that don't leak and more efficient fixtures are going to use less water. So if you go to a new development, it is likely they're not going to be at 500 gallons per day, unless they're those, outliers. And there are outliers, but you'll see in this study, 1% of homes use 500 gallons a day. So, so that's something to, it is something to think about when we think about our flows. So this is that same data looking at it on a per person basis. So here you can see it's anywhere from 30 to 80 gallons per person is what we're typically using in our homes. But a long tail, right? Lots of people using more than that. So I thought this was possibly the most interesting thing that came out of the study for me, and that most, and there's a few exceptions to this, but most regulations assume a linear flow. And what I mean by that is you add bedrooms, you add the same amount. So the regulation I deal with every day is 150 gallons. So every bedroom we add 150 gallons. And we do have some, I would just say, we do have some outlier cases if they don't have a lot of water using devices, but that's the number we use most of the time. But what the data collected in this study shows that as you add people to the home, the per person usage does not stay linear at all. So if you are the one person household, it's right? You're using 76 gallons a person. But if there's two people in the home, you end up averaging 64 gallons. You're down to 50 gallons with three. And so now go to a family of six, right? They're using 36 gallons. Well, if you have a household, again, these are normal homes with six people in it, chances are some of those people are little people, or some of those people are old people. And little people and old people don't use as much water. And when I mean little, I mean under teenagers, right? Because teenagers can be a wild card. And generally older people above 65 don't use as much water either. So that might explain some of this. So there is some thought around should all of our codes not be linear, and we'll kind of get to that whole kind of safety factor issue coming up here, and that we do build safety factor sometimes into our flows. So some of the other key findings of this study is that 2/3 of the indoor water usage was for cold water, so we don't have a lot of hot water coming down the drain. The reductions in use were largely due to more efficient fixtures and appliances. So this was getting back to my California versus Chicago reference. There was not a statistical difference in inside water usage. There was outside. So in those more arid climates, people are more conscious of their outdoor water usage. But not indoor. People are going to do their laundry and flush their toilets. So they may have more efficient fixtures, but it's a function of the fixture, not of their perception of the value of water. They did also look at the economics of what people are paying for their water, also did not factor into indoor water usage. So there were significant reductions seen in off-the-shelf new homes. As I kind of mentioned, the best reductions were seen in high efficiency homes. So these were either retrofitted or brand new homes that were built to be high efficiency. And the authors of this expect that in the future, when we do this study again, we are going to see even lower flows coming out of homes, that this trend will continue. So that kind of leads us to, why do we use such big numbers, right? If this is averaged. Well, keep in mind, this data was developed for municipalities who can design on averages. So, you know, when you have a neighborhood and one family has 6 people in it, one has 2, if that's going to the wastewater treatment plant, it's all averaged out because we have hundreds and thousands of homes that are connected. So we have that buffering that happens when we're connected to a municipal system, but we don't have that when we're with a septic system. So this is the reminder from the last presentation too, that our code values are peak flow values. So that is the day they have graduation or have everyone over for the holidays, and they use 600 gallons. Nobody wants backup right that day. So we need to design that it'll work that day, but we also don't want them using that flow every single day because that's a peak value. So we do not know who will live in that home in the future. So, and we don't have that benefit of averaging. And again, that last one is that we put a lot of safety factor into our flows. A whole nother topic around this is organic loading and designing based on organics versus hydraulics. That's not historically what we've done. And if we move that way, well, then we would see what we're seeing is that concentrations are going up, that the amount of milligrams per liter of BOD or nitrogen, I mean, it used to be that people used to say there would be like 30 or 40 milligrams of nitrogen in wastewater, and now it's 60. And that is all about low flow. So, and the pounds of the contaminant are the same. So depending where you're going with your wastewater, if we're talking about nitrogen, well, if it's getting to an estuary or an ocean, the pounds of nitrogen are what matter. If it happened to be going to groundwater, well, then we do care about the concentration because of the public health risk limit. But so there's just a lot of things to think about when we think about flows, hydraulics, and organics all together and how it impacts design. So if you take the data that I just presented in this study, the average person uses 27,000 gallons of wastewater in a year. Which sounds like a lot of water to me. I don't know if you all think about it, but you're using about 27,000 gallons of water. If you take a family of 3, just showing that data I showed, it's about 58,000 gallons of water a year. And now think about the last septic system you were involved with, and think about the area of the drain field, whatever soil treatment area you had. That's a lot of water that system is processing and cleaning and recycling back into the environment. And that's really what our septic systems are. And kind of as this picture shows it, septic systems are recycling by dispersing that treated wastewater back into the hydrologic cycle. So it needs to be done right in order for this to work, but we only have so much fresh water and we are recycling it over and over again. And then if you think about your community or your favorite lake or your favorite river that has septic systems on it, or your favorite shoreline, so if you had 250 homes, that's 14.5 million gallons of wastewater a year. So the work you all do, making sure there's good septic systems out there, is so important to protecting both our ground and surface waters. So with that, we're going to talk a little bit about flows for design. And so again, this is a picture I took, and this is what we see. And this is, again, a dual alternating pump system. And I have cycle counters and I have running time clocks. And the challenge when I was writing these numbers down, and these were taken at an RV dump station run by one of our state parks, was how difficult it actually was for me, who's someone who's in the industry, out there in the field, to take this data and then get flow data and be like, well, why was that so hard? Well, the first reason it was hard is they were deep commercial tanks. So I need to know one of two things to use these numbers. I need to know how many gallons per cycle, which was not written down anywhere, or I need to know the gallons per minute of the pump. And then I need days between the readings, right? If it was a bigger system, I might even need to know drain back, because all of our systems drain back to the pump tank. So if I had a long supply line. So this data is super useful that I see in front of me, but that is one of our challenges, is a lot of our existing panels that have this aren't telling me gallons per day. They're just giving me data that takes effort. And sometimes that's where things fall apart. So when we look at flows, we have many flows we could talk about. So often what we're talking about when we talk about flows is a permit flow. That's the one that to me is a design flow or a peak flow. Most of the time we are not adding inflow and infiltration. That's something that's more done with cluster systems and commercial systems that run sewer in the street. Once you start running sewer in the street, we sometimes do add I&I because we have leaky manholes and collection systems, but most septic systems we're assuming are pretty tight. So if we're designing a collection system, that's kind of the second one. But to me, the one we might want to think about more is actually the system design. So we'll have that permit flow, but if we're incorporating flow equalization into the system, that's where we may actually be designing our downstream components more based on that equalized flow. And then lastly, the one is what are they actually using? So this would be their percent of their design, and our rule of thumb, and it is not a magic number, but when we look at that data, we would like to see that homes are using 70% or less of their peak flow on an average basis. So when we think about estimating flow for a dwelling, we may want to determine the type of home. So is it the square footage of the house? Is it the number of bedrooms? So sometimes, you know, I've seen homes like a really bad example, you know, a 5,000 square foot home and it's 3 bedrooms. So and I mentioned before, you have multiple kitchens. You know, you can just tell that they're going to be entertainers, whatever it might be. So the type of home, is it a normal home or is it a home that's kind of outside what we would say is normal? So how many water using devices is something else you could look at and think about. So there are things to think about if they have more and more water using devices. And I am not designing per se on that, but if you go to a rustic cabin that doesn't have a dishwasher, sometimes doesn't even have laundry, that is a very different house than the alternative, the one that has all the water using devices. So things to look at, again, water, washing machine, dishwasher, water conditioner, large bathtubs, garbage disposals, self-cleaning humidifier in the furnace, things again that are going to add to the water stream. So what could impact our normal domestic design flows? Well, we already spent a lot of time talking about the first one, which is rentals. Multifamily housing, and it doesn't have to have a second kitchen or laundry, but when it does, we know, again, that's to be not a normal home. But if you know you're designing for multi-generational households, and sometimes you know this isn't a property that's going to sell. There are some family homes you know are going to stay family homes. But the other thing is, do they have any in-home businesses or hobbies that create water or abnormal waste streams? So are they doing commercial food production? And I don't mean a commercial kitchen, but people who are making food that they're going to sell outside their home, dog grooming, salons, brewing and winemaking, daycare. It should be a question on everyone's survey these days who's doing design work is, you know, do they work out of their home? And if they're working out of their home, what's the business? If it's just them sitting at the desk, I'm not worried about it. But once it moves beyond that, that's where we need to start asking those questions. So when it comes to clustering, this is something that is not in all regulations, but it is something that does make sense, that as you have more and more homes connected to each other, you will see some dampening or averaging of flows. So if you have less than 5 homes, I think it's pretty risky to start averaging, but if you have more than 5 homes, are hooked up to the same system, you could consider, and that's all this is a suggestion, is reducing some of those homes beyond the 5. So the idea is you would take the first 5 homes, you would size them normal, but the additional homes past 5, you potentially could look at sizing those at 50%. of those peaks. And I've definitely seen data from cluster decentralized systems that clearly shows those systems are operating nowhere near peak unless their collection system leaks. So if you have leaky collection systems, right, that can be hundreds or thousands of gallons a day. But if we're designing a new system, we hopefully shouldn't have that. So here's just an example of how we might approach that. And this is something that is allowed in our regulations. So if we had 4 homes that were each 4 bedrooms, our number there is 600 gallons. So it'd take 4 times 600, and my design flow would be 2,400 gallons a day. If it was going off the property, that's where I would add that I&I. If instead I had 12 homes, I would design the first 5 homes at that 600, but then the final 7 homes I could design at 300, or half of that flow. So my design flow again would then be 5,000 gallons per day. So what about commercial? So if you're dealing with commercial, well, we have a few options. One is most regulations actually have a table either in their code or in a guidance document that can be used to estimate flows. The challenge that I have seen is much of that data that's in a lot of codes, including the one I deal with regularly, are based on data that was collected in the 70s, 80s, maybe 90s. So before the advent of a lot of our low flow fixtures. So they tend to be on the high side for flows. So I think we really need I would love a national research project to actually gather and update some of that flow data. It's on my wish list for Christmas. Don't think I'm getting it this year. But if you had any sort of existing facility though, that's where we really want to gather daily flow. And that is my first question when someone says they're designing for something commercial is, let's get a flow meter in, because that will give us our best data. And you can't use that alone, because you have to go back to, why are you there? Are you there because it's failing? Are you there because they're expanding? Was there a change in ownership? But it still will give us a handle on, how much water that system is currently processing. Certainly with commercial, flow equalization and time dosing to me are a no-brainer, unless you have a facility that has very consistent usage, which is not very common with commercial. But, you even think about a gas station. I would guess most gas stations, still tend to be busier on the weekend, but it probably depends where they're located. But a lot of our commercial establishments have days where they have very low flow and days where they have huge peaks. So to me, the reason why I say it's a no-brainer is it pays for itself. If you put in a larger dosing tank and a time dose panel, and you're allowed anyway to design some of those downstream components closer to the average, it certainly can help that system work better, but also can be economically viable. So you do, with other establishments, really want to do an evaluation of how they're going to use water, what their fixtures are. Some of you may be aware of the consortium or CIDWIT. They have some great checklists that you can use with commercial facilities. So what we're trying to get is their operational data, their water use habits, their existing system and sampling. Sometimes it can even be useful to take a look at their plumbing plan to see where are all the pipes going and what waste streams you're getting. So the questions on the form are used to gather information to provide clues and insight into the operation of their specific system. So there's really kind of 3 sections to those forms overall. It's facility operation, their water use habits, and then what their actual on-site system. I see your question, Ed, and I have heard no mention of updating the EPA manual. So hours of operation, super useful information. So this one again, they don't list Sunday, so I guess they're closed that day. But this might be a restaurant, right? Or something along those lines. I really don't know what this facility is, because they're kind of weird times. They're just closed for that hour in the middle of the day. But, and again, what we're seeing here is something It's closed relatively early, isn't open a couple days of the week. So super useful information if you were going to design time dosing. So how many hours in a day, how many days in a week, is the flow at all seasonal? So those are all things we could consider when we're going to design that flow equalization system. You want to go ahead, Roger?
I'd be careful with these kinds of signs because, as a prior food inspector, I know folks come in at like 4 o'clock in the morning and start baking, getting ready for the day. So, I mean, these could be vastly, and this is only the time the customers are going to be there, but the employees are going to be there for who knows how long. So,
yeah,
good information, just
yeah,
there's
yeah.
more.
I definitely hear you on that, Roger. And I think this sign, and again, I think restaurants are a very particular usage around all of this, but this applies to all commercial. And I think the better example might be a church, right? So you think about when people are going to be at a church, and you have to be careful there too. Some churches have daycare, some churches have things during the week, but we see a lot of churches 1 or 2 days a week they're used, and the rest of the time they sit. So and you have to, and I definitely agree on this, like, is someone there on Wednesday, right? That doesn't mean they're actually closed, but I'd say there are some mom and pops, there's nobody there on Wednesday. So you really have to dig into the specifics. The other thing is shifts too. I don't think it's on an upcoming slide. I'll just go to this next one. So if you're dealing with some commercial, you also have to look at like how many shifts per day. I mean, there are now ones that are open 24/7, right? Or it could be a gas station, right? It never closes. So definitely they relate to the business or facility. It could be the meals served, it could be the rooms occupied, it could be the number of employees or kids. So many factors really go, but into it. So getting actual usage is certainly key to problem identification. So this is useful when you're troubleshooting systems as well, but you actually need to measure the actual amount of water usage. It should not be assumed that the system is generating the same amount of wastewater as it was designed for, which is what we generally do. We generally think, oh, it was over designed. Well, maybe, but I have seen facilities grow, right? Particularly when you think about commercial, it may have been this was the vision and they're wildly successful, which is awesome, but that may mean that their septic system isn't keeping up with their usage. So other things again to look at is the facility square footage and characteristics. So, this sign on the right might honestly be one of the hardest things for design for. So we could design for what that is today, right? So, convenience / grocery store. Well, the credit union, I have probably a bathroom there. It might even be in the hallway. A Thai restaurant, a Mexican restaurant, cleaners, which is probably my biggest alarm there, and then a flower shop. The issue is, again, is 10 years from now, will that sign look the same? Probably not. But one thing you do see generally, and it's only general, is that sometimes the restaurants stay restaurants. They might just change which restaurant it is. But then I've seen ones where it totally, totally flips. And those are probably the hardest ones. So, the general recommendation with facilities like this that are on septics is that each of those should have its own building sewer and its own septic tank. I think that's really hard to convince people of. Because then you could actually have a flow meter on that business. You could sample that business, but it's just logistically, I think that can be challenging. But that's a great route to go if you can. Otherwise, you're really going to have to design from the standpoint of looking at what this facility says and saying, well, based on what's here, we're going to design for this flow and this mass loading. And then if there are changes in the future, if all of a sudden the credit union's going to become another restaurant, right? We might have to reassess if the system is the right size. So other things to look at, the type of toilets, the showers, are they going to host events? Those can all factor into the volume generation and certainly also the characteristics of the waste. So monthly water readings, collecting monthly flow readings over the course of an entire year can certainly give you an indication of trends. not the answer, but it'll tell you, again, do they have ups and downs? Do they have seasonality in some degree to their water usage? But daily reading should be done over a peak time. It may be hard to know when the peak is, but I think some of you may know when the busy season is, so to speak, for that commercial. But so we had a system we were involved with at a Girl Scout camp, and we had weekly flow data. So every week the system manager wrote down the flow. And so there was a building that was called like the programming center. So it had staff rooms, it had laundry, showers. And so that facility was designed for an average of 500 gallons per day and a peak of 1,000. Well, the time dose panel, so the system had time dosing, wasn't set at 500 because that would be a little risky. It was set at 600, thinking, you know, we have some flow EQ, that should be fine. So the system goes into operation, and the first Sunday it's up, I'm on the text chain to get alerts when it goes off, and I wasn't the service provider, but the alarm's going off. And, you know, I don't think much of it. I'm like, whatever, it's the first Sunday. Well, this happens the next Sunday and the next Sunday. So finally, I reached out to the service provider. I'm like, what's going on? He's like, well, I need to reach out and find out. Well, what we found out is that every Saturday, the Girl Scouts leave and that the staff all does all of their laundry on Saturday and Sunday. And that our weekly flow measurements missed that because we were averaging over the week. So in that case, there were two things that were done. Is one, we could adjust the time dosing on that. The second thing is they actually assign that every staff has a day of the week to do their laundry instead of all doing it in one day. But it's just an example of how when you look at average data, you can miss some of those peaks. So the kind of data that you need is that average daily flow. Are there any surges in flows? Are they going to have special occasions when they use more water? So the peak flow in a restaurant, you know, business in a chain like a McDonald's or a Burger King is, you know, could be different than, you know, a small mom and pop restaurant peak. So it's just difficult. Sometimes we have these ideas about when we think busy times will be, but actually getting your hand on some of that data can be super helpful. So if we're measuring flow for other establishments, just keep in mind, did the business just change ownership? Are they planning to expand or change how they use water? And this, again, this isn't just restaurants. You can think about someone buying an office building. I mean, you know, a church. I mean, things, all kinds of things sell, right? So it could be different. And that is the problem if we have this flow data. And I've also seen when people have a system that's not working, they sometimes are conservative in their water usage. And so that number might jump. So I think the biggest thing is if you can get the owners to think about growth, it's sometimes hard because they don't want the septic system to cost any more than it's going to. But if they have to come in 5 years later and expand it, that cost will be more substantial than if they did it right from the beginning. So again, here's an example of one of those water meters I talked about. So this water meter has a data logger built into it. It doesn't require anyone to write down a number, which is what I love. So what you'll see in the column to the right of the date and time, right? So it took this reading, in this case, this was just the daily flow. You can get these down to the hour, to the minute, probably if you want that data. But I so what I'm showing in the first column is the usage in gallons per day. This facility also calculated how busy they were. And the reason why you might want to do that is if they could see a day where they're actually at full occupancy, if you think about a restaurant, or they're busier, that would tell you what their flow would be if they were at their peak loading. So I think it makes the most sense to me when I think about a campground that's not full. The campground probably wants to design to be full. So that's more like their peak loading. So then what you see on the right is also based on that peak flow is a 7-day peak average. So that is a number I would use if I was, for instance, sizing their septic tanks, because that is if they were at full build out, full occupancy, and there's no time dosing in front of my septic tank. So I want them to be able to handle that peak. And it is the biggest number. And if you came to me and said, well, I'm going to use 3 days of high hydraulic retention time and I want to put 15,000 gallons in instead of 16, it wouldn't be a deal breaker for me because we're building some safety factor in, but it's just an example of like how you could use daily flow data like this. The other thing I just want to point out about this is my adjusted peak flow is really building in some of that safety factor as well, because some people might say, well, I'm never going to be full. Like I'm a restaurant, we're never full, which I don't know if that's true because a restaurant, it might be based more on meals because at any point in a given day, a restaurant is probably, I mean, a popular restaurant is probably full, but it's more, are they their full capacity over the course of the entire day? Well, the answer is no. So that's a little harder to discuss, but we're really looking at designing for what we truly view to be their maximum occupancy for whatever the business is. So it's harder with new facilities. That's where using regulatory tables or other data that's out there, looking for similar facilities, other published and unpublished data. Many equipment manufacturers have data. But I mentioned McDonald's. You just have to be careful that a McDonald's on a freeway is not the same as a McDonald's in a small town. So what is similar? It can sometimes be, if it's a campground, very similar setups, same owner, sounds pretty similar to me, but we can just envision that not all campgrounds are the same either. So, and then certainly a result of your survey could help you estimate flows as well. So the recommendations are to characterize the facility, determine what will be going down the drain. I suggest using those checklists that I referenced because it really helps you work with the owner, and this might be the designer, not the regulator, but to figure out what are the waste streams coming. But if you're getting a plan in and it has a design flow, it needs to be based on something. So it's either based on a table estimated value or it's based on other data they collected, and they need to provide that data to you and it needs to make sense. Because sometimes what I've seen is more and more facilities don't quite fit into our tables super nicely. Like I'll pick the one I've heard about a lot lately is, a wedding barn or some sort of wedding venue. And they are not all the same. Some of them have a kitchen in them and catering, some of them don't, right? Some of them, it's people are there for a couple hours. Some of them have a place where you can get dressed while you're there and spend the night. So some of those don't fit super nicely into our charts. And that's where I think we need a good conversation between the permitting authority, the designer, the owner to come up with what is a reasonable number so we know the system is long-term going to be a good solution. Lastly, during design or management for all existing facilities, several samples should be taken. One sample, whether that be for flow or waste strength, all it tells you is at one point in time, this is how much water they were using, this is what they're putting down the drain or what's coming out of the septic tank. We take grab samples for the most part in our industry. We're not taking 24-hour composite samples, so they truly are grabs. So if I'm going to use that data for design in particular, I really want to know and have multiple samples to base that on. So kind of thinking more about the management side of this and habits, if we really want to reduce flows, habits must change. And this is particularly true on commercial. They may be able to change out some fixtures, but sometimes, and even something like, let's say you have a facility that sprays down their floor, decreasing their water pressure could make a big difference in how much water they're actually using. But the education piece, I think the hard part is you may educate the owner, but who's actually doing the work? Like I always think it's ironic that the person who probably impacts the septic system at a restaurant the most is the lowest paid person, which is the dishwasher, right? So how motivated are they to scrape the plates into the garbage? Probably not, but if we can help the system owners see the financial benefit to managing their water usage within their facility, that can help. And so this does require a good working relationship with the owner, and that the owner is willing to enforce these practices on the employees, or encourage might be the better word. So I've kind of hit this a lot, but water saving devices are definitely an option for lowering wastewater flows, but that's exactly what they're going to do. They're not going to change the organic load to the system. So here's an example, right? We have a four-person household that's putting out 0.56 pounds of TSS per day. They had an old toilet, they replace it. Now they're down to 60 gallons per day. What happens, right? So this is the calculation to figure out mass loading, just done a little backwards if you're familiar with it, but 0.56 pounds divided by how many gallons per day, and the 834 is just a conversion factor that deals with pounds and gallons. So the concentration was 224 milligrams per liter. Well, the only thing that changed in this equation was they went from 300 to 240, and now their concentration went up to 280. So we will see concentrations rise as flows go down. All right, so the last topic is flows for management. This is a picture of that water meter data I showed before, just for reference. So to manage flows, you have to know them. That is definitely a takeaway from today, I hope, is that we need to have better flow data. So if you're seeing reports come in, you're troubleshooting, whatever it might be, it's the first thing I look for, and it's very commonly missing, is actually how many gallons is the system processing, not what it was designed at. So if there is no pump currently in a system or one being proposed, we're really left with putting a water meter in. You could look at their water softener if they happen to have one to see if it tracks flow. If we have a pump, then again, a cycle counter or a running time clock is probably our more common option, although we've mentioned more and more panels are building in some sort of telemetry that could be tied to more daily flow, but even a lot of those I see are not calculating daily flow. But there are some panels out there that can do it. So it's just a function of how much data and do you have the funding. Certainly when we get into commercial, the panel differences are very small, but to some property owners, it sometimes can take some convincing. So commercial and even residential system can change their use over time. So change in family structure is probably the biggest reason in a household. We sometimes have homes that, right, they have 4 people living in them, and eventually they might not, right, as the kids leave home. So monitoring flow over time is really important, particularly for systems that have flow control built into them. So any system that has time dosing, we want to actually ideally know, have they had high water alarms, even if they had low. So one of the systems I sampled last year was at a brewery, and it was not getting the brewery waste, it was just getting the tap room waste. And interestingly, I was out there on Mondays, commonly to sample. And when I would open up the flow EQ tank to take a sample of what was going into the pretreatment unit, I very commonly would see the top of the pumps. The pump tank was very empty. It shouldn't have been empty on a Monday because their busy time period for the brewery, when the most people came to drink beer, right, was Saturday on Sunday. The flow EQ tank should have been, and I know it doesn't need to be plumb full, but it should have had water in it above the intakes of the pump. So what that told me is that their time dose system wasn't set appropriately. And sometimes in particular, when they're set up the first time, people go close, I think too close to the design flow because they don't want the alarms to go off. They don't want to be called back. So from a management standpoint, that's where we really need to have actually that flow data. So hydraulic loading is important. Like I said, I think in the past 5 or 10 years, I spent a lot of time talking about organic load, but the volume of water the system has to process is important. And it's mainly correlated to hydraulic retention times, how many days the effluent has to pass through a septic tank or through an aerobic treatment unit or through the soil, right? So how long does the wastewater even spend in the soil is all a function of how much water is kind of coming behind it. So, and I mentioned already this 70% number. So, and this is a hopefully or something you've all seen before, and we're getting low on time, so I'm going to go through it quickly. But this was my challenge that I had, and I said, why couldn't I easily calculate it? So I was dealing with commercial tanks, and to actually, so he shows it so easy how that tape measures right on the edge. But in theory, in a deep tank, they're hard to hold straight. They're hard to know when you hit the water level. So getting a really accurate number at these sort of depths can be challenging. But if we get all this information, we then know how many inches it lost. And if we know the gallons per inch of the tank, we can then calculate the actual runtime. So in this case, right, we lost 6 inches over the course of this test. So if I know then I had a 4-minute runtime, I can calculate the pump delivery rate. So in this case, during that time period, the pump delivered 112 gallons. If I ran it for 4 minutes, I then know my pump is 28 gallons per minute. So then I can use the runtime between my measurements to calculate the total gallons divided by the number of days, and that tells me gallons per minute. So here's an example kind of showing that, where I have 2 readings that are 10 days apart, right? So I can calculate how many gallons were pumped, and using my 28 gallons. In those 10 days, the system pumped almost 13,000 gallons of water. And since it was 10 days between, it's actually 9 days of readings, right? So I had about 1,400 gallons per day. This would include drain back. And if you have a short pump line, that's not a big deal. But if it was a bigger system, like I said, you're pumping water that comes back, it has to be pumped again. So in this case, my example was going back to that 2,400 gallons per day cluster. 70% of the design flow would be 680. So if I were troubleshooting the system, flow wouldn't be one of my high concerns, although they're using plenty of water, right? But they have some capacity there. So remember this one from before. So let's say this system was designed for 6,000 gallons per day, which would have been a pretty decent design flow looking at this data. 70% of that though would be 4,200. And looking at their data, most of it is below 4,200, but I see a few examples where they were operating above 4,200. So, maybe that was a really busy weekend, or maybe it's when the church had their festival. Who knows what it is? Sometimes you can explain those outliers, but it's useful to be able to look at this kind of data. All right, so my last slide, too much use. So if you have households in particular that are using too much water, they are an outlier. So you need to look at leaky fixtures, too many people. Do they have days they're just exceeding their usage? Should they have an in-home business? Or the more current one I've seen is a point of entry RO. So a point of entry RO is a whole home RO system. So every gallon of water that comes through the house goes through an RO. Septic, and I was at one of these last week, septic systems are not designed to handle that amount of backwash. The under the sink units, no problem, right? We can handle that because if people make a gallon of water to drink, they're creating maybe 4 or 5 gallons of backwash water. But when they're home systems, it has to be routed out of the system. So my official last slide. So this picture was taken in Egypt a few years ago. One of my favorite trips, but I love traveling. So, and I always love coming out your way. You guys all live in such a beautiful state to visit. So I know we don't have a lot of time for questions. If people want to stick around though, I don't see any in the Q&A, but if people want to chat about anything, I'm happy to stick around for a few minutes and talk.
Well, awesome, Sarah. Thank you so much. If we were live, you'd be getting rounds of applause. Really appreciate your expertise and your willingness to come present today. It looks like John Ness has raised his hand, so I will allow you to talk. So you can unmute when you're ready, John.
Yeah, so thanks, Sarah. Great presentation. A lot of very useful information. You talked about you were surprised on how many homes have leaks. I think it was quite a high percentage. And I just want to share, like first story. Last year, I installed some new toilets at my house and my sister's house, and within a year, they started to leak. And come to find out, that particular type of toilet brand is well known for it. It has a fault to it. So I've ordered new seals, and hopefully these ones will be new and improved. But I just share that because even sometimes new fixtures can be prone to leak pretty quickly. So
yeah, no, that's a good note, because I do think, oh, I just saw I have an extra 8 at the end of my phone number, but that's neither here nor there. But yeah, I think that is a good thing to think about. I do know also they sell something, and this would be more like on the commercial lines, I think, that will not allow a toilet bowl to continually run. So you could add it. So again, I don't think most homeowners are going to do that, but if you had commercial businesses where you're worried about no one finding the toilet leak. But yeah, good point.
Did anybody else have any questions for Sarah?
Well, I'm
You're
not
getting
seeing
some
anything
kudos in the chat
so-
there.
Yep.
Yeah, I have it open. Thanks, everybody.